In 1945, civilians from the German village of Hurlach were marched into the midst of the horrors of newly liberated Kaufering 6, a subcamp of Dachau. As they moved from the crisp spring air into the zone of stench and death and disease, they protested that they did not know that this horror existed. Could it be true that people living in the midst of 11 such subcamps, 11 such sites of oppression and misery, did not understand what was happening to their fellow humans on their very doorstep? Could it be true of other Germans? The answer is that they knew enough to avoid knowing more, effectively giving consent to Nazi crimes by embracing ignorance. They turned their backs on those whose suffering should have made them weep and rage and take action. They were monsters, but they were human monsters, ordinary monsters. We know that the protestations of innocence amongst ordinary Germans were hollow. Innocence is not knowing something. Ignorance, on the other hand, comes from the word ignore. Ignorance is an act of will, but in our time are we not even closer in our digital world to the suffering of the Gaza Holocaust? The images of death, the sounds of pain, and the voices of grief and fear penetrate our homes. We carry them in our pockets. We carry them in our pockets. It is likely that few of the people reading or hearing these words are amongst those who ignore this torrent of suffering, and many of us probably feel a duty to bear witness by enduring the sights and sounds and stories, knowing that the pain of doing so is but a distant, muffled echo of the pain of those who must live these events in person. But we are not representative of our society. We are surrounded by those who embrace lies and hate, those who refuse to know, and those who understand that a wrong is being done, but who fail to take any real stand. The people of Germany during World War II were not a different species than us, and we are not immune from the same descent into inhumanity. Monsters are not born, they are made. They are made by a machine. Germany had a monster-making machine, and we have our own. The machine has many parts, but the mechanism at the center is the news media industry. The more you look into their behavior in reporting the Gaza Holocaust, the more horrifying their actions become. Their role in this regard is almost exclusively to promulgate callousness, ignorance, cowardice, confusion, and spite. Not one day of the last 15 months have passed in which they have not radically and profoundly violated the journalistic standards and news values that are at the center of their claims to professionalism. It began with the shock of the attack on October the 7th, 2023. It was immediately obvious that the Israeli response was going to be far more deadly than the incursion into Israel. Few could have guessed the scale and the duration of the Holocaust that was to come, but no reasonable person could not have known that thousands of innocent Palestinians were going to die. Did the media respond with the basic human duty to act to protect those innocents? They did not. They employed every iota of sensationalism and sentimentality they could, effectively whipping up fervor with no regard for what was about to be unleashed. Did the media feel that with the threat of mass death hanging over a people known to be trapped and defenseless, it should at least practice strict vetting so as not to promulgate disinformation and misinformation? They did not. They allowed the Israeli government and dubious non-governmental organizations to spread lies. lies that many people believe to this day. Many people believe that 40 babies were beheaded. Many people believe that a baby was roasted alive in an oven. Most people believe that there were mass rapes committed by Palestinians. Those lies are spread with the volume turned up to 11, and only a tiny minority of news organs ever report when they are debunked, and they do so with far less fanfare. The New York Times published the malicious fabrications of Screams Without Words and received global coverage, while those who raised clear concerns with the reportage that demanded answers were absent from the media. Israel's prosecution service has just admitted that despite rigorous efforts, they cannot yet find substantive evidence of a single instance of rape to build a case from. That means that those who claimed to have proof of rape are liars. That means that those who claim to have meaningful evidence of rape are liars. And that means that the news media who promulgated those claims as if they were all but proven are liars. Nor do they have any compunction about keeping lies alive long after they are known to be lies. When Joe Biden said, quote, "I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children," the follow-up was more of a cover-up. The White House walkback of the comments made absolutely no explanation of why they were said. No news media asked the obvious questions about why the statement was made, including the question of whether this crucial leader responsible for the ongoing genocide was deliberately lying to promote slaughter, or whether he himself had been deceived to that same end. Amidst an endless churn of media interest over Biden's acuity and competence, this explosive story was for some reason treated as a mere gaffe. A similar mumbling silence descended on the world's media when Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, claimed unambiguously to have seen a woman being raped on camera. The duty for journalists to expose the lies of high officials is clear, and there could be no more urgent and grave circumstance than during a time of relentless daily killing. She lied blatantly, and the purpose of the lie was to generate support for the slaughter of innocent people. Why was this not a massive story? Meanwhile, all of the violence being inflicted on Palestinians is normalized, minimized, and sanitized. Lives lost when hospitals struck, we are told. By whom? The passive voice has become so overused in headlines that it is like a sick joke. But for some reason, no matter how much ire it raises, the habit remains, as if the news media are afraid that changing will just highlight how cruel and dehumanizing the practice has been. Now, attacks on hospitals don't even make it into most news formats. Imagine the drama of the stories that came out of Kamal Adwan Hospital in its last days. Patients and medical staff dying in airstrikes and sniper attacks, even as they struggled to save the lives of those maimed in attacks outside. Think only of the story of Mahmoud Abu El-Aish, an injured 16-year-old boy who was in the foyer of the hospital, confined to a wheelchair while waiting for an X-ray, when quadcopters entered into the hospital and shot at will. He was killed along with another patient. There are pictures available of the dying boy as staff struggled to save his life. What could be more worthy of the so-called news values that are meant to shape editorial decisions? How could there be a more dramatic story than this high-tech murder so reminiscent of dystopian science fiction? Most people in the West probably do not even know that there are small armed drones that literally hunt people down. Most people don't even know that they hunt down and kill children, including small children. They hunt down and kill children, with reports suggesting that children are the most common victims of this form of violence. There are so many stories that are too moving, too novel, and too significant for any reasonable person to judge them unworthy of coverage. Yet they remain unknown to most Western news consumers. Let me just focus on one small but important group of people: doctors. How many people know, for example, that the head of orthopedics at Al Shifa Hospital, Dr. Adnan Al-Burj, died in the notorious Stade Taman detention center of maltreatment? Testimonies about the circumstances of his death suggest that he died of internal injuries sustained through rape. This prominent man seems to have been raped to death, and that is not judged to be particularly newsworthy. Eyewitnesses who have travelled there and returned are almost absent from most Western news coverage, including very prominent doctors. Where, one might ask, are the long, prestigious, mainstream interviews with people like Ghassan Abu Sita or Mads Gilbert or Nazar Mahmoud? The latter doctor is a professor of transplantation surgery who gained a little bit of coverage when he broke down giving testimony to a UK parliamentary committee. He said that after airstrikes, quote, the drones would come down and pick off civilians, children. We had description after description. This is not an occasional thing, end quote. Mahmoud is certainly well-spoken and authoritative enough that you would think they would be clamoring to feature him in all forms of media, especially when you consider that he has made a significant contribution to medical science and has appeared as a character in the famous popular drama The Crown. Editors and producers should be hungry to profile and interview this doctor or others like him, but they are nowhere to be seen. We can all probably think of stories we know that would shake our Western compatriots from their complacency. From statistics to personal stories of loss to statements of visceral hatred and criminal intent from Zionist leaders. Just a few such stories would serve to show most people that Israel's actions are not merely tragic, excessive, or insufficiently mindful of civilian suffering. The suffering they inflict is not incidental. It is part of their genocidal purpose. It is the armed conflict with the tattered remnants of some impoverished militias that is incidental. Militias, by the way, whose only source of weaponry is now the unexploded ordnance used so profligately against their civilian compatriots. Instead of manufacturing a false balance, the reporting should be relentless and one-sided because the events are relentless and one-sided. It is only at this late stage that our media are slowly moving away from framing each new day of massacres and hunger and cruel displacement with constant references to October the 7th and Israeli hostages, as if Gaza's population shared a collective guilt. This is a form of racism made to seem acceptable by making the false claim that Israel has some form of legal right to use military action as self-defense. The constant refrain that Israel has a right to defend itself, spouted ad nauseum by the likes of Piers Morgan, is the big lie of our times. It is a bad faith argument that falls apart once you admit that Palestinians have a right to self-defense and think through the consequences of that. But you never hear or read in mainstream analysis that Palestinians have a right to self-defense. Israel has the right to use legal avenues to seek the prosecution of individuals who committed crimes or ordered them to be committed, but the right to use military force in self-defense cannot be invoked in the case of ongoing aggression or occupation. In response to armed resistance, Israel does not even have the right to use military force against armed groups outside its internationally recognized territory, let alone inflict collective punishment, let alone commit genocide. The media are fabricating excuses for Israel and creating false equivalence between murderer and victim. This is purely a response to power. They have internalized the need for fake balance so much that they avoid newsworthy stories that shatter that fragile construction. They evidently feel that they would fail in if their hard news products do not leave room for confusion and ambivalence. They then assuage their consciences by running colour pieces about the human cost, as if this were not the real story, as if the ground truth meant nothing in understanding the actual nature of events. A Holocaust is occurring, and only the most tiny amount of the violence has been in actual combat. Yet these pathetic hacks call this orgy of genocide the Israel-Hamas war. There are no two sides to this Holocaust. There is no room for debate. There is truth and there is deceit. There should be no in-between. But in our age of post-truth politics, digital authoritarianism, and focus group-driven fascism, the vast bulk of Western people live in a limbo of delirium, amnesia, emotional fatigue, and consumerist narcissism. That space is created by the monster-making machine with our news media at the center. The truth of what is happening in Gaza is available to our journalists in a flood, a deluge that keeps pouring out of that tiny territory with a force unlike anything this world has seen before. The most documented Holocaust in history is everywhere, and it takes a powerful act of will to avoid the truth. The worst thing of all is that in doing so, the Western media are betraying the extraordinary work of their Palestinian colleagues. 203 journalists and media workers have been killed in Gaza since October 2023. Abu Bakr Abed gave a recent speech pleading for solidarity and referring to journalists being killed by being, quote, immolated, incinerated, dismembered, and disemboweled. I do not believe in heroes, but I struggle to find any other way of referring to the journalists in the Gaza Strip. Israel has excluded Western reporters, but there is no shortage of quality journalism coming out of the Holocaust. There are things that are familiar to activists, but unfamiliar to the public, such as the Flower Massacre, the Super Bowl Massacre, the debunking of the lies about Al-Shifa corridors and tunnels, the stories of starvation, the murder of people fleeing in humanitarian corridors or in safe zones, and much else. These things we know largely because of the work of Palestinian journalists. They produce a surfeit of important stories. Therefore, as an editorial decision, does it not behoove Western media outlets to react to the banning of Western journalists by refusing to allow Israel's blatant attempt to conceal the truth of its actions? Would it not make sense to say that if our journalists are not allowed to report, we will use the large core of journalists already there, and soon Israel will see the futility of trying to prevent reporting and thus let our reporters in? This could have happened, but the Western world refuses to treat these professionals with the respect they deserve. In a recent interview, award-winning correspondent Hind Hassan said that Arab journalists are treated as intrinsically political. To me, this is a polite way of referring to despicable racism. Hassan mentions the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, who was witnessed by 5 professional journalists. 5 people who make a living from reporting on events witnessed the killing, but when it came to Western news media, they were brushed aside in favor of Israeli Hasbara mongers whose profession is to push a predictably one-sided narrative with only a very tangential relationship to factuality. Israel's denials of wrongdoing are so predictable and so irrelevant to evidence of fact that it makes it seem almost bizarre that they feature in our news at all. So often, though, the news media insist on treating them as authoritative to the point where, as with the Abu Akleh killing, we are expected to accept their own self-exonerations. The implication is that as a Western power, their institutions seek to ensure that their personnel act with legality. This is a racist lie. We don't accept non-Western countries investigating their own war crimes, and we should not accept it from any Western country. And given Israel's well-documented and repeated unpunished criminal acts, it is clearly a malicious practice to give any credence to their inevitable claims of innocence. It is not merely the work of Palestinian journalists and witnesses that is given the right of Hasbara response treatment by our media. Third parties, regardless of how authoritative and disinterested, are treated as if they are partisans, making meticulously researched 400-page reports simply because they have some form of beef with Israel, and therefore Israel must be given equal space and time to deny those reports. It is not as if our news media ask Hamas their opinion on such reports, even though this slaughter is apparently the Israel-Hamas war. Western media love Israeli Hasbara to the point where self-evident information operations by intelligence organizations are amplified with willful credulity by some and with malicious pro-genocide racism by others. Israel's famous pager attack in Lebanon killed and maimed many civilians, especially healthcare workers. 300 people lost both eyes in the attack, and 500 lost one eye each. Reports of children killed were available almost immediately, as was shocking footage of civilians maimed in these attacks. The illegality was glaring. The attacks clearly violated the principle of distinction between legitimate and illegitimate targets established clearly in the Geneva Conventions. They are even more blatantly in violation of an additional protocol which states, quote, "It is prohibited to use booby traps or other devices in the form of apparently harmless portable objects which are specifically designed and constructed to contain explosive material." When the shocking crime occurred, though, there was an obvious simultaneous information operation to accompany it. The giveaway that makes this operation so evident was the immediate consensus around tone and themes. If you cast back your mind, you may remember that within an hour of the first attacks, there were many instances of the same puerile statement that thousands of Hezbollah terrorists had simultaneously had their testicles blown up. This childish sadism and triumphalism is frighteningly reminiscent of the way fascists and Nazis portrayed their early atrocities. Yet it became the baseline emotion and the angle from which the Western media approached the crime. Far from being the wary skeptics that journalists would like us to believe they are, they showed themselves to be easy marks whose culture of self-congratulation creates a herd of infantile sheep. Now, with a ceasefire imminent, Western news media and other institutional liberals are gearing up to rewrite history so that they were the voices opposing genocide all along. Amnesty International has already positioned itself as the superior voice because it waited for over a year before using the dreaded G word, as if the case presented 10 months and thousands upon thousands of deaths earlier by South Africa at the ICJ was in any way inferior to their belated response. Those who abetted the genocide will now reinvent themselves as its greatest and most important opponents. We who stood against the lies of self-defense, we who called it genocide from the beginning, will be treated as the premature anti-fascists were treated after World War II, or the equally premature anti-war lefties of the 60s were treated, or the anti-apartheid dissidents who were repressed for decades and then treated as irrelevant after the end of apartheid in South Africa. The beauty of Western liberalism is that no matter what horrid things you actually do, you can always claim to have been pulling in the other direction because of your innate and unquestionable values of equality, democracy, and happy Hollywood endings. Now is also that rare moment when someone in my position is able to do something other than preaching to the choir. Because a lot of you hearing and reading these words are going to be tempted by the post-ceasefire narratives of the resumption of normal service. They will lure you with a sense that belatedly the institutions of Western justice have started to move back into gear, enforcing norms and being a role model to lesser countries, just as God and Voltaire intended. However, this ceasefire will not be a ceasefire. It will bring much relief from the intensity of the current situation, but the people of Gaza will still be suffering under deprivation and continued violence. The genocide did not begin in 2023, and it will not end with a ceasefire. Worse still, history going right back to the opening of the First Intifada in 1987 has shown that each time Israel reaches a new watershed in the intensity of its violence, it maintains a higher level subsequently of normalized murder. A banal slaughter that comes in dribs and drabs that, not coincidentally, is considered too regular and expected to be newsworthy. This has already been happening in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while attention is drawn away by the slaughter in Gaza. History also suggests that the next time there is an explosion of Israeli military force, it could be of a similar magnitude to that unleashed in the Gaza Holocaust. This happened after the 2008-9 assault known as Cast Lead, which established a clear pattern of behavior. The more such violence becomes habitual, the less our news media deign to care about it. Ceasefire notwithstanding, our activism must continue with as much dedication as ever. We are not fighting to end the current Holocaust. Perhaps that was never possible, but we must fight to stop the next. We have the greatest tool, the greatest weapon possible in that battle. We have truth. We have truths. Documented, demonstrable, incontrovertible truths that can be made into universal known verities. Things will change if we make it impossible for our political leaders, our academic leaders, and our news media to prevaricate. But be aware that the storyline will change next time, and the scam will change. That is why it is crucial that we do not leave the self-defense lie unchallenged. That is why it is crucial that we do not allow them to imply that the genocide is ended with a ceasefire, or is somehow only technically a genocide now that fewer people are being incinerated each week. Genocide is never acceptable, regardless of the level of accompanying violence, And it is not merely a legal fiction to call a slow genocide a genocide. The most bitter truth that we must face, though, is that Israel has every reason to congratulate itself on its recent geopolitical victories in the region, including the massive immiseration of the people of Gaza. Undoing that immiseration is a monumental task. We have to work to abolish the genocide support systems that allow Israel to do this. And that means fixing our politics and fixing our media. We have to be resolute. We have to be meticulous. We cannot lose faith. And above all, we have to support each other. We're not fighting to be winners. We're not fighting for victory over our enemies. We are fighting for justice and peace. The struggle always continues.